Hello, lovies. This is a video for your Unit 8 sampling review. I'm going to go over some of the multiple choice questions and then I'm going to talk about the free response. I'm not going to show you any solutions to the free response, but I do want to give you guidance on a couple of the problems just in case you're struggling to get started. So we'll start with the multiple choice, and the first one that I wanted to look at was number 4. If you have me for 2B, I already went over these with your class, so you can skip forward to the free response if you'd like. So this problem is talking about a newspaper editor that wants to investigate whether residents of a city support a proposal. So they want to do stratified sampling, and they want to know which of these accurately describes stratified sampling. So I think at this point we all know that when we're talking about stratifying, it's because we have groups within our population. So we have different groups within our population. So we could go back to that auditorium example where we have 4 rows in the auditorium. And our example was that each row represents a grade level, which would then mean that each grade level has the same amount of kids. So there were 15 kids in this row, 15, 15, 15. And when we've talked about stratified sampling in this class, we've always talked about how we're going to take the same amount from each group, because what we get from a stratified sample is equal representation. Now, a better way now to phrase that is that we will get a sample that represents the population. So we've been talking about it in terms of equal representation. Well, this problem addresses something different. So what happens if, instead of the numbers working out nicely, you have in your population the same groups, but let's say you had 2 rows of 12th graders. So between these 2 rows, that would mean that 50% of your population is 12th graders. And then this could still be 11th, so that would be 25%. But what if this were 10th and this were 9th grade? So we'll just, to make things easy, call 9th grade 12% and 10th grade 13%. So what are we supposed to do in a population where one of the groups is very large? Well, we do want our sample to be representative of our population, so it would make sense that when we take our sample, we want most of our sample to be 12th graders. In fact, we want 50% of our sample to be 12th graders, 25% to be 11th, 13th to be 10th, and 12% to be 9th. So the answer that's describing that is this one that says we're going to select people from each district based on the proportion of city residents in the district. What they mean by that is, because remember, proportion means the same thing as percent. So what they mean by this is, if you have a population and you know the proportion of the different groups in the population, you want to pull that same amount for your sample. And it all goes back to, you want your sample to look like the population. So if it's not a perfect world and we don't have exactly 25% that are 12th, 25% that are 11th, and so on, you want to take that sample so that it actually looks like the population. So hopefully that makes sense. If I lift up this Post-it note, you can see that the correct answer for number 4 is B. We're going to select a random sample from each voting district. So that's the strata. Each voting district is the strata. But we're going to base it off of the proportion of residents in that district. So we're just trying to ensure, because for like a district like Salt Lake City, there's so many people that live in Salt Lake City, you want there to be fair representation of that, compared to a district of like, I don't know, San Juan, where there's very, very few people that live in that district. If you have any questions about this, let me know, because this is, you could see this again. So we just want to keep in mind that the basic idea from stratifying is that we want our sample to look like our population. And sometimes the only way that we can control that but still have a good sample is by stratifying. So what I mean by control is we can control the amount of people we select from each group. So we still have randomness, we still have a good sample, but we do get to have some control over making sure that our sample really represents our population. So please make notes on that if you need to. Like maybe we need to make a little note that stratifying gives us control. Or gives us some control of our sample. Gives us some control of our sample because we can determine how much we take from each group. We can ensure that the sample looks like the population. Okay, then the next one that I wanted to talk about was number 5, because I do these first. I think you guys know that, and then I check answers, and I got this one wrong. So they give the procedure of how they're going to take a random sample, and they're going to call people. So the firm has automated its sampling so that random phone numbers within the United States are called. So random phone numbers within the United States are called. Tells you what they do when they call, and then it wants to know which is not a concern. Which of these is not a concern? One thing that is easy to miss in a question like this is that they're not telling us where these numbers are coming from, and you have to have some kind of background knowledge or some information about where companies, where political parties will get just lists of people's phone numbers. So there are a lot of, like, when you like download a new app and stuff, or when you go to get a new phone from Verizon, you have to read terms and conditions, and you have to say whether or not you agree to the terms and conditions. And oftentimes what's in those terms and conditions is they're going to tell you whether or not they're going to share your personal information with other companies. Well, why would they share your personal information? For reasons just like this. They could give your phone number, your name and your phone number, to another company, a polling organization, a political party, so that they can sample, so that they can call you and ask you questions or try to sell you something else. Like, I know that when I get a number that calling that is not like one of my contacts, the name that pops up is potential scam, or no, potential spam. So lots of the time they get that number from some other company that you gave your phone number to. So that all being said, I missed the fact that this is saying registered voters with unlisted telephone numbers may be underrepresented in the sample. Well, this isn't an issue because these numbers that they're using, they don't need to be listed. Like back in the day, we had to use a phone book and like look people's names up in a huge phone book or look companies' names up in this huge phone book. That's what it means for your number to be listed. So we don't really have listed and unlisted telephone numbers nowadays because most of us have cell phones. So I just talked your ear off a lot. I apologize. The short answer is number 5 is B. It doesn't state whether or not these phone numbers were listed. They just say they're calling random numbers within the United States. Okay, next up is number 8. So on number 8, I originally answered to reduce bias when estimating mean commuting time, and this answer is really echo. It's to decrease the variability in the estimates of the mean commuting time. So this is the main function of stratifying. Like, we are trying to make our sample look like the population, because if our sample looks like the population, then we will get estimates that are close to the true population value. If we don't stratify, we could end up in a situation where we have like a bunch of 9th graders in our sample when really there's like 2 9th graders that we should have taken. So we stratify to decrease the differences in the samples that you take. So remember, if we take a bunch of samples, most of them are going to be around the true value. Well, that's going to happen if you stratify. If you don't stratify, then you're going to get a lot of varying samples that are not going to help you get close to the true value. So the main function is E. The more our sample looks like our population, the closer we get to the true value. C, one of my students, Hannah, she reminded me when I went over this with her class that this idea of reducing bias, we don't really reduce bias and we don't really remove bias. What we can do is choose sampling methods that don't result or that we know have a low chance of resulting in bias. So if anything, by deduction, hopefully we could have figured out echo if we remember removing bias and reducing bias. Bias doesn't necessarily work that way. We want to have the smallest chance possible of getting a biased sample. And that is not the same thing as reducing bias. Okay, next one is 11. So 11 is an idea that we're going to talk about a bunch in Unit 9 because it is experiments, and experiments, the biggest difference between an experiment and an observational study is that in an experiment you can prove causation. In an observational study, and I wish that they would have used the word sampling instead of observational study, because I think here they're referring to an actual observational study, but also like a sample survey. So, when you're sampling, you cannot show causation. You can see correlation, you can see a relationship when you sample, but we have to remember from Unit 3 that correlation does not equal causation. So no matter what, no matter how the sample was selected, causation cannot be determined from an observational study. It has to be an experiment. You can only get causation from an experiment. I'm just double checking if that's our last one. Yes, so I believe that's our last multiple choice that I wanted to talk about. So let's go to the free response. Let me just double check that I got all of them. I marked them in the one that I did, so I just want to make sure that I got them all. Okay. So explain the bias and state if your sample will predict a value that is higher or lower than the population's value. So in each of these, you have one for A and one for B. You want to make sure that you address three things. So you want to say this sample is biased because. So what is the bias? In this case, it's question wording. So I'm just going to write QW. So this sample is biased because of question wording. Then you want to say why. What about this question, the wording of this question, is biased? So be specific. Actually mention, well, I don't think we should start the phrase with Americans should. Like, Americans should is going to lead the respondent to agree. So you want to be specific about what in the actual statement is going to lead to bias. And then you want to say, will it predict a higher or lower estimate than the actual, I think it's a proportion. So three things. What is the bias? Why? Be very specific about why. Is it a higher or lower estimate? So same with the teenagers who drink and drive. What is the bias? So I think that this is response bias. People are unlikely to tell the truth about drinking and driving. Why? Because it's illegal. They probably don't want to get in trouble. Maybe they don't want to admit that that's things that they do. And they especially don't want to admit that in front of their policeman or their principal. And will this lead to a prediction that is higher or lower? Well, it probably leads to a prediction that's lower than the actual proportion of teenagers who are drinking and driving. So, number one, you want to hit these three things. What is the bias? Why? Be very specific. Will it end up with a higher or lower? Number two, an automobile manufacturer is trying to determine the proportion of customers that have an issue with their car. So part A, I think, is very straightforward. Describe a sampling method. You could use HAT method here. You could use your calculator. The most realistic is probably using an online website. So this one, there's nothing tricky about this one. You just need to know how to describe taking a random sample. The next one, explain why we should not use the estimate of 0.325 as the proportion of new cars that experienced a problem. So the hint for this one is that the issue lies with this. Of the 40 customers who reported a problem, 13 customers reported a problem specifically with power door locks. So the percent that they have found is 13 out of 40, not 13 out of 1,000. So you need to be able to describe why that is an issue. Based on the results of a sample, give the point estimate of the number of new cars sold that will experience a problem with their power door locks. So you actually have to, I should say that differently. Step one, you have to find this proportion, and then you need to multiply that, whatever this percent is, you need to multiply that by the number of cars in the population. So your answer will be something like 20 cars It's not a percent. They don't want you to give a percentage here. They want you to actually give an estimate of the number of cars sold that will have a problem with the power door locks. So find the proportion, multiply it by the number of cars in the population. That will give you your point estimate. Number 3, why would we want a statistical, what would be the statistical advantage of using the median of the reported incomes rather than the mean? So one thing to keep in mind here for this problem is that income often is skewed right. That's your hint. Income is often skewed right. So if you need to, go back to Unit 1 and look at the cases in which we would choose to use the median instead of the mean and describe why we would want to do that. I'll give you one further hint. Your response needs to include the word resistant or not resistant. So those are your hints. Income is often skewed right. It would be in your best interest if you use the word resistant. Number 2, which of the 2 methods, or part B, I think that one's okay. Yeah, I think that you're okay on B. Okay, C. C, I think that you guys will be okay. I don't know why I said C. Number 4, cluster sampling. You would want to take all of the trees from the plots. So you're going to randomly select some of the plots and look at every tree on that plot. Stratified sampling would be a disaster because you want to take some trees from every single strata or every single plot. So stratified would be kind of a nightmare because you would need to take trees from every little square you see here. Whereas a cluster, you would just randomly select some of the plots and then look at every tree on that plot. Advantage of cluster sampling, it's quicker and easier, but describe why it would be. So be specific why. A stratified sampling, the advantage is always that there is a greater chance that your sample will look like your population. There is a better chance or a greater chance that sample will look like population. And then last one, this has to do with Unit 7. So just as a reminder, because I still have your guys' Unit 7 work, type 2 error is 2 is true. Hypothesis 2 is true. So that means that the HA is true, but we fail to reject. So I have that here. Hypothesis 2 is true, but we conclude the null. We fail to reject. So you have to describe that in context. You can't just say the alternative is true, but we conclude the null. You actually have to add context, like really less than 35% of these adult residents can pass the fitness test, but we conclude that the proportion has not changed. It is 35%. What would be a consequence? We'll look at the reason why they're even doing this test in the first place. They want to fund more physical fitness programs. And they're trying to show, hey, we need these programs because really less than 35% of our adult residents could pass these tests. So if we don't show what we meant to, are we going to get our funding? B, you get a p-value that's like the largest p-value I've ever seen in any example I've ever done. So the p-value is 97%, which is way bigger than any alpha we would ever use. The default alpha is 5%. Our p-value is 97%, so we definitely fail to reject the null. We do not have evidence of HA. We do not have evidence that it's less than 35. And then C, I think you guys will be okay with, describe a primary flaw in the study. So, hopefully that was helpful. I'm sorry that I talked for 10 years about the multiple choice, but ultimately I think if you understood the things that I was discussing, you'll be way better off once we start actually doing reviews for our exam and when we take our exam. Okay, that's it.